To this day, I still haven't gotten around to playing Sonic Superstars. Just from the initial trailer, I knew it wasn't going to be for me. I've always been more of a modern Sonic fan myself, and now that we as Sonic fans are actually getting good stuff relating to that part of the franchise between Frontiers and Shadow Generations, this didn't grip me in the same way that, say, Sonic Mania did. Regardless, I still kept up with it prior to release, so I knew about the basic structure and plot, and of course, the biggest selling point of the game, Trip. Even if I see much less about her than I do about Sage or Shadow's new powers, to compare with the other recent Sonic releases, I knew she had developed a following, and she seems like a fairly well-liked character. Well, she's liked enough to warrant someone developing an SRB2 mod for her, at the very least. Developed by a team helmed by Lightdasser, the character has been popular, and now I've finally gotten around to looking at her. She may have come from the most recent 2D Sonic game, but how does she fare now that she's been reimagined in sort of 3D? Even if I've never played it, I know that Trip's moveset in Superstars is fairly basic. You can climb walls like Knuckles, and you have a double jump, but that's really it. Of course, it's a 2D Sonic game, and a moveset much more complex than that would be very difficult to implement when considering everything else about that style of game. But Trip would need more than just that to stand out in the much less stifling world of SRB2. There's a million characters with those two abilities in their arsenal, and most would be able to boast much more than that on top. Luckily, there have been alterations, and Trip has gained a few new abilities to boot. Of course, the double jump and wall climb are still there, and are still the core mechanics that should influence how you go about playing as Trip. But they've now been expanded upon, and have some synergy with a new ability called the Bounce. It acts mostly as you'd expect if you played a Sonic game before. Pressing the jump button after already jumping activates the double jump, but if you keep holding the jump button until you hit the floor, you'll bounce off the ground for a little bit of speed and height. Your basic game plan then is most reminiscent of Knuckles if comparing to the vanilla roster. You'll be looking to climb walls to take shortcuts, then combining your double jump, bounce and spike cling to cross large gaps which would otherwise require a glide. In other words, your goal is exploration more so than speed, and when using the aforementioned moves in conjunction with Trip's ability to cling to ceilings and perform stomps, there's pretty much nowhere you can't reach. You move fluidly from Knuckles' path to Amy path and back, often in surprising and novel ways, and collecting a ton of goodies in the process. But proper routing is needed to offset the fact that Trip just doesn't have the ability to build up speed in the same way characters like Sonic can. Of course, part of your role as a critic is to recognize areas in which your chosen topic is lacking, and when I first booted up a save file as Trip, I thought I knew exactly what the problem was. When you're first starting to use it, the bounce can be a bit of a struggle to control. I find it has a habit of arcing in a way that feels generally a bit off. Maybe it's the speed, maybe it's the arc, but whatever it is, it doesn't feel quite right. I wouldn't say that you get used to how the bounce works, or that practice negates the problem, but it does become less noticeable as time progresses. And that's because, simply put, I just didn't use the bounce after a while. I just didn't think it was necessary. I used Trip Spikeling and double jump constantly, and even climbed on ceilings and used the stomp a fair bit. But I just didn't find many use cases for the bounce. It just doesn't feel like it makes you go any faster. Apparently you want to be using it on slopes, but in those moments, I find it's just better to roll and build up speed that way. Outside of that, the only other flaw I really noticed was how the stomp still acts as a bounce. It just shouldn't do that. No further detail needed. With Trip's incredible ability to find a way into almost any path in SRB2's vanilla set of levels, you'll probably collect your Chaos Emeralds fairly quickly. And if you've played Sonic Superstars, you'll know that Trip has a very different super form to everyone else in the Sonic series. You certainly gain the yellow colour scheme, increased speed and invincibility that everyone can expect, but you also turn into a quadrupedal dragon. I've always disliked how formulaic most super forms are, but that's definitely not a complaint I can make here. On top of the basic suite of enhancements you always get, your entire moveset is overhauled. Jump now triggers a permanent flight, and Spin activates your fire breath, which is entirely unnecessary but certainly fits. I wish more super forms were like this, unafraid to be a bit radical and really change how a character plays. The only flaw I can really point to is that the fire breath is a bit inconsistent with how it affects the area it covers, but that'll be a limitation of how the Doom engine processes these sort of AoE attacks. And besides, you're invincible anyway, so it's not like an enemy is going to do much when push comes to shove. But if you think differently to me, and prefer your super forms to stick to the form healer, there's another option. I've refrained from discussing these aspects of characters in the past, but I'd like to bring it up here. If you download another mod, the Rust Characters Pack, and collect the Soul Emeralds, Trip unlocks their Soul form, which outside of a unique colour scheme, is a much more standard interpretation of the super form. I don't like to talk about aspects of characters that are only available if you download another mod, because I haven't done that before and now a precedent has been set, and if I was to account for them in my rankings now, it would make a huge number of previous reviews incomplete. But this is minor enough, entirely outclassed by the base super form, that I don't think it'll have much of an impact on my final thoughts. If you really dislike Trip's dragon form, at least you have this option, but I'm not going to be running to activate Rush characters for this. I've always thought that Light Dash's collection of mods had strong sprite work. For more examples of their work, look at Casey, Tangle or Whisper. But when the other artists on the team include names like Motoroads and Inazuma, who were responsible for similarly fantastic looking characters, yeah, Trip is a looker. I don't think it's their strongest work, which might just be due to how I'm not a huge fan of her overall design, but there's a strong degree of consistency throughout, and an attractive colour palette. In moments where some extraction is required to sell the movement, such as during a jump, the decision to make the movement stretches more angular than usual complements Trip's design, and her personality shines through where possible, such as her idle animation. She puts on her helmet worn throughout Superstars, before rocking back and forth. It'd be really good if this was a diegetic way to put this helmet in a similar manner to how you can take Jackal's mask off in Guilty Gear Strive, but alas, it falls off as soon as you begin moving. And then, if we return to her transformations quickly, I think these are also quite strong visually. Starting with the soul form, just because there's less to talk about, I think the Darker Sage Trip develops in this form look really good as a subtle change to her colour palette. Really, outside of a few exceptions like Sonic or Shadow, most Superform colour changes are quite slight. Tails becomes yellow instead of orange, Knuckles becomes pink instead of red, and so on. So, this fits well for a more subdued transformation. Of course, the Superform is a bit more extreme, and I think this looks good too. The reduction in the number of overall movement options you experience in this mode means that there aren't too many sprites, especially without a new idle animation. but what is there is alright. The fire left behind from Trip's fire breath is definitely the highlight of this form though, as I really like the additional effects it has that make it feel slightly more intense than most of the fire in the vanilla game. Just compare it to the fire in the Brack Eggman fight, which looks better to you. Playing as Trip changes a few of the themes throughout the game to match equivalents from Superstars, or at least remixes of themes from Superstars. Again, as I haven't played Superstars, I can't say for certain, but the tracks are a little different to the versions I'm finding on YouTube. The two that I found had been changed were the Superform theme and the Fang Boss theme. Whether or not you like this change will ultimately depend on whether or not you like the Superstars OST. I like these new songs myself, but you can change them back to the original tracks via console commands. It does feel like a bit of an arbitrary selection of tracks that they've modified, seeing as the invincibility and speed sneaker jingles aren't changed despite also having equivalent versions in Superstars. But it's a good start. It just needs to be expanded upon in the future. Overall, Trip is a good reimagination of the original moveset into the third dimension. She's more of an explorer than a speedster, with a heavy emphasis on traversal abilities and a lack of speed increasing options. But she executes the concept well, and I did end up playing differently as her compared to conceptually similar characters like Knuckles. Unlike a lot of mods, I'm also given high marks for Trip's superform. Whereas most are formulaic, repetitive, and feel like an obligation, there's something much more unique here. Obviously, I understand the team here had greater liberties with Trip than teams working on other characters, purely because of how Trip had a more unique transformation than most in a game of Origin, but that's just how these things go sometimes. Finally, the audio-visual experience is strong throughout, particularly the visual side of that equation. Hopefully more Superstars audio is brought in to finish what the team has already started, but as I've already said, it's a good start. I think Trip deserves a solid 8 out of 10. I can't point to any particularly major flaws, nor can I relate any particularly major improvements for the future. The mod is what it is, and it does it well. I hope you enjoyed the video, and ciao.